On a quiet shelf in a forgotten archive in Madrid, there sits a piece of folded paper drawn by a Spanish hand more than 400 years ago. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The paper shows a river bending through low green hills, and beside that river, a cluster of shapes that look like flat-topped pyramids. Above the largest shape, the mapmaker wrote a single word in faded brown ink. The word, when you squint, seems to say Etowah. That word, or something close to it, is the oldest written name for a place that should not, by any honest reading of the textbooks, exist at all. Walk with me for a moment. Picture northwest Georgia in the slow heat of late summer. The Etowah River moves like dark green glass between banks lined with willow and sycamore. Cattle stand in the shallows. A two-lane road hums in the distance. And then, just off that road, the trees pull back and the land lifts. 3 great earthen mounds rise out of the floodplain, flat on top, steep on the sides, covered in close-cropped grass. The biggest of them stands taller than a 6-story building. From its summit, on a clear day, you can see the blue smudge of the southern Appalachians. This place is called Etowah, and the mystery of it is not that it is here. The mystery is what it once was, and why it stopped long before any English farmer turned a plow in this soil. Etowah was a city, a real city, with thousands of people, with palisade walls, with packed earth plazas, with workshops humming in the riverside heat. Smoke rose from its fires day and night. Copper was hammered here into shapes so fine that no one alive today fully understands how they were made. Marble was carved into the calm, half-smiling faces of seated figures, men and women whose eyes seemed to look right through you. Shell from the Gulf, mica from the Carolinas, copper from the Great Lakes. All of it moved through this town, along trade roads that stretched for 1,000 miles. And at the top of that great mound, in a wooden temple that no longer stands, a class of men is said to have lived who did not speak. The stories, handed down from the Creek and the Cherokee, from the old Spanish journals, and from a few stubborn farmers in the 1800s, all describe them the same way. Tall men, painted in pale clay, heads shaved smooth except for a single knot, robes of woven feathers. They moved through the plazas in slow, measured steps. They tended the fires. They lifted the copper plates to the sun on certain mornings, and in all the tales, in every version, they never made a sound. Not a chant, not a prayer, not a word of greeting. The silent priests of Etowah. Then, sometime in the middle of the 1500s, the smoke stopped rising. The fires went cold. The workshops emptied. The temple on the great mound was left to the rain. By the time the next wave of Spanish travelers passed through these valleys, the mounds were already wrapped in vines, and the people living nearby would only point at the hills and shake their heads. What happened here? Who were these silent men, and what authority did they hold over a city of artists and farmers and traders? Where did they go when the fires went cold? And why does the ground still give up, every few decades, copper masks beaten in the shape of falcons, marble babies with closed eyes, and shell discs etched with crosses inside circles, inside crosses, all sealed in earth as if hidden from something coming over the next ridge? Scholars argue about it still. Some say Etowah was the seat of a powerful king, a god on earth, whose family ruled by force, and whose priests were merely servants. Others say the priests themselves were the rulers, and that the kings answered to them. Some believe Drought emptied the city. Some believe a war we have no record of, and a quiet few believe something stranger, something the silent priests themselves may have known about, and may have walked away to meet. Tonight, we are going to walk that ground together. We are going to follow the smoke back to the workshops along the river, climb the green sides of the great mound, and try to read the faded ink of a map that says, in a single brown word, that a city once stood here, whose name the world has nearly forgotten. Picture the land first. Picture it before the towns had names, before the roads had numbers, before anyone thought to draw a straight line across the soil. This is North Georgia. The hills here roll like the slow swells of an old ocean, soft and green and gentle. The dirt under your boots is red, not brown, not orange, red like rust, red like dried blood, red like the inside of a clay pot left too long in the sun. The Cherokee called this color the breath of the earth. When the rain falls, the red runs down the hillsides in thin ribbons and stains the rivers a soft pink for a mile downstream. The trees grow thick. Oak and hickory and tulip poplar stand shoulder to shoulder along every ridge. In summer, their leaves close over the trails like a green roof, and the light that filters down is dim and watery, the way light looks at the bottom of a slow pond. In autumn, the same trees burn gold and copper and deep red, and the whole country looks like a fire that forgot how to move. Cut through the middle of this land is a river called the Etowah. It runs wide and shallow over flat stones, and in most places you can wade across it without wetting your belt. The water is clear in the summer and the color of strong tea in the spring. Mist sits on it in the mornings, the way smoke sits on a banked fire. Trout swim in the deep pools. Beaver build their lodges in the slow bends. Sycamores lean over the banks with their white bark peeling like old paper. Now follow that river. Walk along it for a day, maybe two, until the valley opens up and the hills step back. The trees thin. The ground levels into a wide, flat plain. And here, rising out of that plain like something built by giants, you would have seen the city. The year is somewhere around 1250 in England. A king sits on a stone chair. In France, men are cutting the windows for Notre Dame. But here, in the red hills of Georgia, there are no kings and no cathedrals that anyone in Europe has heard of. There is only this, a city of earth. The walls came first. A wooden palisade taller than 3 men, made from whole pine trunks driven deep into the ground and lashed with rope of woven bark. Towers stood every 60 feet along the wall, square and watchful. A wide ditch ran outside the palisade, deep enough to swallow a horse and rider whole. Though no horse had ever set foot in this country, inside the walls, the mounds rose. 3 great pyramids of packed earth, flat on top like tables. The largest of them climbed 60 feet into the sky, with a wooden temple at its peak and a long ramp of logs running down its eastern face. The smaller mounds sat to the north and the south, each crowned with its own buildings. Smoke trailed up from those temples day and night, and the smoke was not grey, the smoke was green. That was the strangest thing a traveller would have noticed first, the green smoke. It curled up from the workshops along the river and from the furnaces at the base of the mounds, and it smelled like nothing else in the world. Sharp, metallic, a little sweet, the smell of copper being worked. Below the mounds spread the houses of the people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were built of cane poles, bent into arches and plastered with mud and grass. The roofs were thatched with river reeds. Each one had a small garden beside it, and in the gardens grew corn taller than a man, beans climbing the corn stalks, and squash spreading along the ground in big yellow waves. Children ran between the houses with shell beads in their hair, Dogs slept in the doorways, women ground corn on flat stones, and the soft scraping sound of it carried across the whole town like a heartbeat. Light at night came from torches of pine pitch and from the cooking fires inside the homes. The fires showed through the doorways as soft orange squares, hundreds of them, scattered across the dark plain like fallen stars. Above the mounds, the temple fires burned brighter and never went out. This was the city. This was the place. Red dirt under it, green smoke above it, a clear river running past, and the smell of hot copper hanging in the air like a held breath. And somewhere inside those walls, walking the high paths, were the priests who never said a word. The man rode into the southern wilderness in the spring of 1540, and the country had never seen anyone quite like him. His name was Hernando de Soto. He was a Spanish soldier, lean and sharp-faced, with a beard cut close and dark eyes that missed nothing. He wore steel that had been polished raw by months of riding. His horse was a tall bay mare, mud spattered to the chest, with bells sewn into the leather of her bridle, so the sound moved with him through the trees. Behind him came 600 men. They walked in a long, ragged line that stretched a full mile through the pine. Some rode horses, most did not. They led pigs by the dozen, herded along to feed the army as it walked. The pigs squealed and grunted and rooted at the loam, and the smell of them carried far ahead on the wind. Men in iron helmets carried crossbows on their shoulders. Priests in dusty black robes walked with their sandals slapping the dirt. African slaves carried iron pots and ropes and the heavy wooden chests that held the army's powder dry. De Soto was looking for gold. He had found a fortune already, years before, helping take down the Inca far to the south. He had come back to Spain a rich man, but riches did not settle him. He wanted another mountain of silver. He wanted another king's room piled high. So he sailed for Florida and marched north, and he asked every village he passed the same question, through trembling interpreters. Where is the metal? Where is the shining stone? Where are the rich towns? For months, the answer was nothing. Swamps and cane brakes, villages of thatch and corn, friendly chiefs and frightened chiefs, and a few who fought him in the rain. The men grew thin, their boots split open, the horses pulled up lame on the Flint Creek beds. De Soto rode at the front and said little. He had a habit of running his thumb along the pommel of his saddle when he was thinking. A small, slow movement, back and forth, polishing the leather smooth. Then, somewhere in what is now Alabama, the rumor reached him. It came from a captured boy, a thin teenager with a copper bead at his throat and bare feet caked in red clay. The boy told the interpreter, and the interpreter told the priest, and the priest told De Soto. There was a city, north and east of here, past the next ridge of mountains, a great city ruled by a woman. Her people pulled copper from the ground in shining sheets. Her temples sat on hills built by hand, and the men who served her gods did not speak, not ever. Not a word. De Soto leaned forward in the saddle and asked the boy to say it again. The boy said it again. Silent priests, houses of red metal, a queen who wore the sun on her chest. The Spaniards called the country Coosa, after the river that ran through it. The chronicler, who walked with the army, a careful man named Rodrigo Rangel, wrote down what he heard. He wrote of a province so rich, the natives spoke of it the way Spaniards spoke of Seville. He wrote of orchards and grain stores and towns so neat the lanes ran straight as a string. He wrote of the priests in particular, because that was the detail his pen kept returning to. Men who served the temples on the high mounds, men who, by some old promise, had given up their voices. You can picture De Soto reading that report by candle, the wax dripping onto the page, his thumb moving back and forth on the saddle pommel even as he sat at the camp table. He had heard stories like this before, in the Andes, and those stories had been true. He gave the order. They would march for Coosa. The boy walked to the front with a rope around his neck. He pointed at the gap in the Blue Mountains and said the name of the river beyond them. De Soto nodded. The pigs squealed. The bells on the mare's bridle rang a soft chiming rhythm as she stepped. Somewhere ahead, in the red hills of North Georgia, a woman in a long deerskin robe was waiting. Her name has been lost. Her people called her something the Spanish never wrote down right. She ruled a city the world has almost forgotten now. And in the temples on her mounds, the silent priests were tending fires that had not gone out for 200 years. His name has been lost to the wind. The Spanish writers who came after De Soto called him only the Scout, or sometimes the Forward Man, as though a name would have weighed too much on the page. He was a soldier of middle years, sunburned to the color of saddle leather, with a beard the shade of wet straw. He rode a tired bay horse that had carried him through swamps and pine barrens and creeks the color of strong tea. On the morning he first saw the towers, he was not looking for them at all. He was looking for a place to water the horse. The summer had been a soft one in the Coosa Valley. The corn stood high and green in the bottomlands, taller than a man on horseback, with tassels the color of pale honey. The river itself ran slow and wide, the color of milky jade where it bent under the sycamores. White herons stood in the shallows like little priests of their own, patient and unbothered. Smoke from cooking fires hung in thin blue ribbons above the trees, and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasting squash and the sweet rot of river mud. This was an ordinary morning, in an ordinary place, if you knew where to look. Women walked the paths along the river with baskets of river cane balanced on their hips. Children chased each other through the corn rows, their bare feet kicking up small puffs of red dust. Old men sat on the open porches of thatched houses, weaving fishing nets from twisted bark, their fingers moving without thought. Dogs slept in the shade. Somewhere far off, a flute played 3 notes and stopped, and then played them again. The whole valley moved at the pace of a slow breath. The Scout drew his horse up at the edge of the tree line and forgot for a moment what he had come to find. In front of him rose a hill, but was not a hill. He had seen enough country to know the shape of the earth, and this thing did not match it. It climbed in clean, square shoulders, each level flat as a tabletop, each side as straight as a stretched cord. Grass grew on it, soft and green, and trimmed close as a sheep's back. At the top stood a building of cane and clay, painted in long bands of red and white, with a roof of golden thatch that caught the morning sun. Smoke rose from a single hole in that roof, thin and pale and very straight. Behind that great mound stood another, only a little smaller. Beyond it, a third, and around them all curled a wide ditch and a wall of timber as tall as 3 men. This was a city in the woods of Georgia in the year 1540, and no one in Spain had ever drawn it on a map. The Scout sat his horse and breathed. He saw people moving through gates in the wooden wall, carrying loads of firewood, baskets of fish, jars sealed with clay. He saw a long plaza of swept earth between the mounds, smooth and pale as bone. Boys played a game there with a polished stone and long sticks, and the stone rolled and the sticks flew, and the laughter floated up to him on the wind. He saw a woman grinding corn on a stone slab beside her doorway. The white meal, piling up like new snow. He saw a man split a chunk of cane with one easy stroke of a copper blade that flashed in the sun like a small fish. There was no fear in any of it. No one ran. No one shouted. The city went about its mourning the way a city does when its mourning has gone the same way for 100 years. The scout took off his iron helmet and let the river wind cool his head. He had ridden through villages of mud and bark for weeks. He had eaten parched corn and gone hungry. He had begun to think the rumors of a great chiefdom in these hills were only the dreams of hungry men, and here it was, laid out below him, like a painting in a book of hours, complete and calm, and entirely unbothered by his coming. He noticed something else too, though he could not have said why it stayed with him. On the highest mound, near the painted temple, 2 figures stood very still. They wore long capes of feathers, dark at the shoulders, bright at the hem. Their faces shone in the morning sun, as if polished, though they were too far for him to see clearly. They did not move. They did not speak. They watched the river, and they watched him, and they said nothing at all. By the time the first English traders crossed the Blue Ridge in the early 1700s, the towers were already gone. The mounds remained. The river still bent the same way through the same red clay. But the city itself, with its furnaces and its smoke and its quiet workers, had been empty for nearly 300 years. The Cherokee lived in that country now. They had cabins of bark and log along the creeks. They had cornfields and fish weirs and council houses round as drums. They were a forest people, calm and watchful, and they knew every ridge of those mountains the way a mother knows the lines on her own hand. But when the traders asked about the mounds, the Cherokee went quiet. It wasn't a refusal. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like the silence that falls in a room when someone mentions a name nobody wants to say. A small hush. A glance at the floor, a change in the air, soft as a curtain moving in a draught. One trader, a Scotsman with a wool coat the color of wet bark, wrote it down in his ledger. He had been hauling iron pots and glass beads up the old paths from Charleston, and he had camped one autumn night near the great flat mound by the Etowah River. The leaves were turning, the water ran low and clear over white pebbles. His Cherokee guide cooked a small fish on a stick and would not look at the mound at all. The Scotsman asked, in the few words of Cherokee he had learned, who had built it. The guide chewed his fish. He pointed with his chin at the river, then at the sky, then at the ground beneath the mound. He said one word. The Scotsman wrote it down as best he could, in letters that don't quite match the sound. The word, in the trader's spelling, meant something like the old ones, or the people before. It might also have meant the people who went under. The Scotsman pressed. He asked if there had been Cherokee long ago. The guide shook his head, slow and certain. Not Cherokee. The guide said the Cherokee had come into this country after, and had found the mounds already standing, already silent, already covered in vines and saplings, as if the forest itself had been told to grow over them and not stop. Then the guide said something else. The trader wrote it in the margin, in a smaller hand, as if he wasn't sure he had heard right. The guide said the priests there had not used their voices. They had spoken with their hands, and with bright metal, and with the smoke of the fires, but never with their mouths. And when the Cherokee came up the river, the guide said the priests had been gone for so long that even the grandmothers of the grandmothers had only heard of them in stories. The Scotsman closed his ledger. The fire snapped. An owl called from somewhere across the water, low and slow, and the guide tilted his head to listen as if the bird had said something worth knowing. Other traders heard versions of the same thing. A Welshman named Price, working the Coosa Valley a few years later, wrote that the Creek and the Cherokee both seemed to avoid the largest mound on certain nights of the year. He could not get a clear answer about which nights. He only noticed that on some evenings the trails near the mound were empty when they should not have been, and the village dogs would not cross the old plaza, and the children were called inside before dusk with a sharpness that did not match the season. A French priest, Father Auburn, riding through with a Catawba escort in 1745, asked his guide about the carved stones he had glimpsed in a riverbank wash. The guide answered him by walking faster. Father Auburn wrote in his journal that the man's face had taken on the expression of someone passing a graveyard at night, though it was full afternoon and the sun lay warm on the path. None of these men were folklorists. They were not collecting legends. They were merchants and missionaries with ledgers full of pelts and prayers, and they only wrote down the strange things because the strange things would not leave them alone. What the Cherokee knew, they would not say out loud. What they would not say, the traders could only circle the way a moth circles a lamb. The mounds sat there in the red dirt, full of something. The river moved past, and somewhere in the silence the Cherokee left open, the question began to take shape. Who had the silent priests been? Long after the towers had crumbled and the river had taken back its banks, the stories still moved through the hills around Cartersville, like smoke through pine needles. Old folks in North Georgia talked about them on porches in the slow part of summer, when the cicadas thinned out and the light turned the color of weak tea. They said there had been priests in that old city by the Etowah, priests who walked the mound stairs in white deerskin and copper plates, priests who never said a single word out loud. The story came down in pieces. A grandmother in Bartow County would tell it one way over apple butter and a cold biscuit. A farmer leaning on a fence post would tell it another way after the cotton was in. Nobody had the whole shape of it. Everybody had a corner. At the general store in Etowah Village, men gathered around the stove in winter and traded what they had heard. One man said his great-uncle had walked the big mound as a boy and felt the ground hum under his bare feet. Another said his wife's people, who had Cherokee blood going back 4 generations, would never set foot on the flat top after sundown. The clerk behind the counter, weighing out salt pork, would nod along but never add his own piece. Some things you listened to, you did not stir them. The tavern down by the ford kept a different kind of talk. There the stories went deeper into the strange. A drover passing through swore he had heard, out in the bottoms one foggy morning, the sound of a long line of feet moving in perfect time. No voices, no drums, just the soft press of moccasins on wet leaves, hundreds of them, passing him by while the mist hid whatever made the sound. He drank his cider and would not go back that way after dark. The church steps on Sunday brought out the gentler version. Women in calico, smoothing their skirts, spoke of the silent priests like a sad song. They said the old holy men had taken a vow long ago, a vow to keep some great word locked behind their teeth. To open their mouths even once would be to let the word out, and the word was too heavy for the world to bear. So the priests walked the mound and prayed with their hands and their eyes, and the slow turning of copper discs in the sun. They never spoke, not to greet a stranger, not to comfort a child, not even, the women whispered, to call out when the end finally came. A blacksmith in Cassville had a piece of the story that the others did not. He said his father had bought a small copper ornament of a trader years back, no bigger than a silver dollar, hammered into the shape of an eye. The blacksmith kept it in a tin box on a high shelf. He told anyone who would listen that the eye had once belonged to one of the silent ones, that if you held it close to a candle on a still night, you could almost feel a voice trying to come through the metal. Almost, never quite. The Cherokee who still lived nearby had their own way of speaking about it, which mostly meant not speaking about it at all. When a white neighbor asked too plainly, the answer was a long look and a change of subject. The weather, the corn, the price of hogs, now and then, though an elder would offer a single sentence and then close the door. The priests were not of our people, one woman told a Methodist missionary in 1847. They were here before us. They went under the ground before we came up the river. The missionary wrote that down in a small black book and underlined it twice. Children, of course, made their own version. They played a game in the schoolyard called Silent Priest. One child would stand on a stump with arms raised, and the rest would try to make him laugh or speak. Whoever broke the silence lost. The winners walked away feeling like they had touched something old without knowing what. That was how it went, all across those red clay counties. A line at the store, a whisper at the church, a drunkard's tale at the tavern, a child's game in the dust. Each one a small piece of a city that had stood by the river and gone quiet, each one circling the same dark center, without ever stepping into it. The priests had not spoken in life. They would not speak now. The hills, however, had been listening. Long before the Spanish ever set foot in the red clay hills, before any white man had heard of a place called Etowah, the trade roads were already old. They were older than the oldest grandmother in any Cherokee town, older than the names anyone still remembered. The paths ran like veins across the eastern half of the continent, north to the cold lakes, south to the salt marshes, west to the slow brown rivers of the heartland, and copper moved along them like blood. You have to picture the country as it was 1,000 years ago. No fences, no fields of cotton, just a sea of forest, hickory and oak and chestnut, broken now and then by a glittering river or a meadow where the buffalo grazed. Through that green ocean ran narrow trails, worn knee-deep by countless moccasins. The traders carried packs on their backs. They walked in single file. They knew every spring and every safe ford, and they passed that knowledge down like a precious cup. The copper came from far away. Some of it traveled down from the shores of Lake Superior, where ancient miners had been chipping pure native metal out of the rock for thousands of years. Other pieces, the old stories say, came from the southern Appalachians, from veins hidden in the slopes near what we now call Ducktown. Either way, the copper moved south, always south, toward the warm river valleys where the great mound cities rose. Salt moved with it. Salt was as precious as the copper, maybe more. Without salt, meat spoiled, hides could not be cured. The body itself grew weak. There were salt licks in Kentucky and salt springs in the lower Mississippi country, and the people who controlled them grew rich. Traders carried it in woven baskets sealed with pine pitch. They walked for weeks to deliver a single load. Shells came up from the Gulf, big whelks and conchs, polished smooth, carved into cups and gorgets that hung on the chests of imported men. Mica came out of the mountains of western North Carolina, sheets of it thin as paper, splitting into mirrors that caught the sun. Muscle pearls from the Tennessee River, galena, the heavy lead ore that crushed into silver paint, bear teeth, eagle feathers, things that mattered. The Coosa Valley sat right in the middle of all this motion. That is the thing to understand. Etowah did not grow up in some forgotten corner. It rose at a crossroads. The river itself ran like a highway, west toward the Mississippi country, and the trails crossed the river at exactly the place where the mounds would later stand. Anyone who controlled that crossing controlled the flow of wonders. Copper coming in, salt going out, shells and feathers and stories. The Cherokee, who came into this country later, remembered fragments. They spoke of an older people who had lived along the rivers and who knew the secret roads. They told of trails so well used the grass would not grow on them. They said the old ones had walked from the cold north to the warm south, carrying baskets of bright metal, and that the sound of their footsteps had been like soft rain on leaves. There were rest houses along the way, small camps where a traveler could sleep without fear. Some of these were marked by piles of stones that every passing trader added to, until the cairns stood taller than a man. A few of those stone piles are still out there in the Georgia woods. Hikers walk past them and never know what they are. The forest has grown over the old roads, but the roads are still there, just under the leaf mold, hard packed by 1,000 years of human feet. Now, picture a copper ingot, raw and rough, leaving the shore of Lake Superior in the hands of a trader. It passes from one set of hands to another, season after season, town after town. By the time it reaches the Smiths of the Coosa Valley, it has traveled 1,500 miles. It has been touched by dozens of strangers. It has crossed languages and territories and quiet little wars. And when it finally arrives, the silent priests take it and weigh it in their palms and study its color, and they begin the slow work of turning it into something holy. That is the deeper history. That is the river of motion the city stood inside. Etowah was not an accident. It was the cup at the bottom of a long, long slope, and everything precious in the eastern woodlands eventually trickled down into it. The mystery of the silent priests begins there, in the patient walking of those forgotten roads. In the summer of 1817, a young surveyor named Daniel Wilcox walked the bottomlands along the Etowah River with a brass compass tied to his belt. He had been hired to map farm boundaries for the new Georgia counties. He was 23 years old, careful with his pencil, and he could not sleep at night because of what his compass kept doing. The needle drifted, not always, not everywhere, but when he crossed certain low ridges in the river bend, the needle would swing 2 or 3 degrees east of where it should have pointed. He wrote it down each time. He thought maybe iron in the soil. He thought maybe his hands. He started over, sat the compass on a flat stone, and watched the needle pull anyway. The land around him looked ordinary at first. Red clay banks, cane breaks thick as walls, white oaks taller than ship masts. But the longer he walked, the more the ground began to feel arranged. Little rises that lined up too neatly, hollows that ran straight as wagon ruts. He climbed one slope and saw, half buried in vines, the shoulder of something far too large to be natural. It was a mound, a great flat-topped him of packed earth, taller than the steeple of any church he had ever seen. He sat down at its base and ate cold cornbread and tried to imagine the labor, basket by basket, year by year. He guessed at the volume the way a surveyor guesses, in cubic yards, and the number he got made him stop chewing. He stayed 3 more days. He found 2 smaller mounds nearby, set in a triangle with the first. He found a ditch, filled in but still readable, that wrapped around the cluster like a moat. He paced it off. The shape was not a circle and not a square. It was a careful, deliberate plan, drawn by people who had thought about angles and sightlines and the place where the sun came up in winter. Wilcox climbed the tall mound at dawn on the 4th morning. From the top he could see the whole bend of the river. He could see where two creeks fed in. He could see ridgelines that lined up perfectly with the corners of the platform under his feet. The city, if it had been a city, had been laid out the way a jeweler lays out the setting for a stone. He went back to the nearest farmhouse and asked the old man on the porch what he knew. The old man chewed a bit and said only that the Cherokee had told his father to leave the mounds alone. The Cherokee, the old man said, had not built them. The Cherokee had moved in afterward, when the place was already quiet, and they had walked around the edges, not through the middle. Wilcox wrote a letter to a professor in Savannah. He drew his maps in ink and sent them along with measurements and his guesses about volume. He asked what the professor thought. The professor wrote back a polite, short reply. The mounds, he said, were likely natural formations shaped by the river. The compass drift was likely a flaw in the instrument. The professor wished him well in his surveying career. Wilcox put the letter in a drawer and kept walking the riverbanks anyway. He found more. He found pieces of pottery, thin and painted, broken under the roots of a sycamore. He found a stone with a hole drilled clean through it, a hole so smooth and round he could not understand how human hands had made it. He found, in the soft earth after a rain, a sheet of green metal no bigger than his palm, hammered into the shape of a bird with a long curving beak. He carried the copper bird back to his rented room and set it on the windowsill. In the candlelight it looked older than the hills. He turned it over and saw faint lines pressed into the back, lines that seemed to mean something, the way letters mean something, though he could not read them. He wrote a second letter. This one he did not send. In it, he asked who the people had been and where they had gone, and why a place laid out with such care had been left for the forest to swallow. He asked whether the men who built the mounds had been the same men who hammered the copper. He asked whether the silent priests in the old Cherokee stories were a memory of something true. He stopped writing in the middle of a sentence. He never finished the letter. He kept the copper bird for the rest of his life. The mountain sits about 30 miles north of the old city. Folks around Ducktown still call it the Copper Basin, and the red dirt there glows like banked coals when the sun goes down. People have been pulling green stone out of those hills for longer than anybody can count, and a few of them, over the years, have told stories about what they felt while doing it. One of those people was a man named Asa Coker. He worked the pit mines in the 1880s, long after the silent priests were gone. But he grew up hearing the old tales from his Cherokee grandmother. He gave a short interview to a Knoxville paper in 1902, and a clipping of it still sits in a county archive, brown at the edges. Asa said the copper knew you were coming. That was his phrase. He said when you walked into one of the older shafts, the ones cut by hands long before any pickaxe touched the rock, the air changed. It got warm and close, like the breath of a sleeping animal. He said the stone hummed under his palm. Not loud, just a soft buzz, like a beehive heard through a thick wall. He claimed the old miners had left marks on the walls, little pecked symbols, shaped like fish, and open hands and circles inside circles. He used to trace them with his thumb while he ate his lunch in the dark. He said they were warm to the touch, even when the rest of the rock was cold. A woman named Sarah Lightfoot told a similar story 60 years later to a folklorist passing through Polk County. She was the granddaughter of a Cherokee man who had hidden in those hills during the removal. She said her grandfather used to take her up to a certain ledge where the green stone showed through the moss. He'd put her hand flat against it and tell her to listen. She said she could hear singing, not with her ears, with her bones, a low, slow chant that rose and fell like breath. She was maybe 7 years old at the time. Her grandfather told her the singing came from the old workers, the ones who had carried the copper down the rivers to the city of Mounds. He said they were still down there, deep in the rock, and they had never stopped working. She said she believed him then, and she said, sitting on her porch as an old woman, that she still believed him. There's a third account, stranger than the others. A geologist named Foster came through the basin in 1936, doing a survey for the federal government. He kept a private notebook, separate from his official reports, and his grandson donated it to a university library in the 1990s. In it, Foster describes climbing down into an abandoned shaft and finding the floor scattered with stone hammers, round river cobbles, worn smooth on one side from striking the wall 1,000 times. He picked one up. He wrote that it was warm. The shaft was cold and damp, 60 degrees at most, but the hammer felt like it had just been set down by a hand that left the room a moment before. He sat on the floor and turned the stone over in his palm. He wrote that he felt watched, not threatened, just watched, the way a child is watched by a patient grandmother who has all the time in the world. He sat there for a long while. He wrote that he wept a little, though he could not say why. When he climbed back into the daylight, he left the hammer where he had found it. He said it didn't belong to him. These three voices, separated by decades, all reach for the same word. They all say the mountain remembers. They all describe a warmth that should not be there, a sound that has no source, a presence that does not press but simply abides. None of them claim to have seen anything. None of them claim a haunting in the way ghost stories usually go. The copper, they say, was worked by people who left part of themselves in the rock, and that part has not yet gone home. What the archaeologists know is plainer. The old miners used fire and water to crack the stone. They built hot blazes against the rock face, then doused them with cold creek water, and the rock split along its veins. They picked out the green nuggets with antler tines and hauled them down to the river in baskets of woven cane. They walked them 90 miles south to the city by the Etowah, and then one season they stopped coming, and the mountain went quiet, the way Asa and Sarah and Foster all said it never truly did. Now here is where the loose threads start to weave together. Old stories from people who never met begin to rhyme. The Cherokee elders, who would not say the word for the city. The DeSoto chroniclers, who wrote of smoke rising from a place they called Coosa. The hunters who saw stone towers in the mist. The diggers who pulled copper from the mounds. Each one held a piece, and every piece pointed back to fire. The Etowah Valley, by every account that survived, glowed at night, not from a single hearth or a cooking pit, from rows of furnaces set along the riverbank like teeth in a long jaw. Travelers from far down the trade roads said you could see the light from 2 ridges away, a soft orange bloom against the underside of the clouds, the kind of glow that made strangers stop their canoes and stare. The smoke had a color too. People who came from the salt country to the south remembered it as greenish. People who came from the Shell Coast remembered it as blue. The Cherokee word for the smoke, passed down in fragments, meant something close to sky-changing. 3 different peoples, 3 different tongues, all describing the same strange tint hanging over the same bend in the river. The furnaces themselves were low and round, built of river clay packed over a frame of stone. Each one stood about waist high, with a domed top and a single mouth facing the wind. Inside, charcoal burned slow and hot beneath layers of crushed copper ore brought down from the mountain trails. The mouth glowed cherry red by day. By night it glowed white. And here is where the rhyming begins. The Spanish chronicler who rode with de Soto wrote of a town where the men work metal in great fires that never go cold. He did not know what to make of it. He had seen the silver works of Peru. He had seen the gold smelters of Mexico. But this was something different, something older in feeling. He wrote that the workers moved in shifts, like monks at prayer, and that the fires were tended through the dark hours by figures who did not speak. 200 years later, a Moravian missionary traveling among the Cherokee wrote almost the same words. He had never read the Spanish account. He could not have. The chronicles were locked in a library in Seville and would not be translated for another century. Yet his journal describes ancient pits along the Etowah River, where the old men say the priests fed the fires in silence, and the smoke turned the moon green. 2 men, 2 centuries apart, 2 languages, the same fires, the same silence, the same strange-colored sky. A third account surfaces from a trader named Bartram, who walked these hills in the 1770s. He camped one night on the old terraces above the river. He wrote that the ground beneath his blanket was warm, not from the day's sun, which had long since faded, from something older buried below. He scraped at the soil with his knife and found a layer of black ash and reddened clay, hard as brick, 3 feet thick in places. He had stumbled onto the floor of a furnace that had not burned in 300 years and was still holding its heat in memory. The pattern keeps showing itself. Archaeologists who dug the site in the late 1800s found those same hardened floors. They found slag, the glassy waste left when copper is pulled from its stone. They found charcoal pits as wide as wagon wheels. They found bellows nozzles shaped from clay and fired hard. The furnaces had been many. They had been used for generations, and they had stopped all at once on a date the soil can almost name. What were they making in such numbers, day and night, year upon year? Not tools. Copper is too soft for axes and too rare for cookware. Not coins. These people did not trade in money. They were making something else, something the smoke itself seemed to bless, something the silent priests carried out of the workshops, wrapped in deerskin, and laid down only in the deepest chambers of the mounds. The pieces are starting to form a shape. A city built around fire, a priesthood that did not speak, a craft that drew workers and traders from 1,000 miles of forest, a glow on the clouds that lasted, by every reckoning, for more than 200 years. And then, one season, the fires went cold. The smoke stopped changing the sky. The river ran clear again, the way rivers do when no one is working beside them. The pattern, whatever it had been, broke. Walk with me down to the riverbank now. The Etowah River runs slow here, the color of weak tea, curling around the foot of the great mound like a sleeping snake. The water smells of clay and wet stone. On the south bank, where the ground levels out into a wide flat shelf, the old stories say the workshops stood in a long row, each one open to the river breeze. You would have seen them first as a line of low cane roofs thatched tight against the rain. Smoke rose from each one in a thin, steady ribbon. The walls were woven from river cane and plastered with red clay, and the clay had been polished smooth by the touch of countless hands. Inside, the floors were packed earth, hard as fired pottery, dark with the soot of 100 years of slow burning. This is where the copper came to life. The raw stuff arrived in rough sheets and rough nuggets, hauled in baskets on the backs of traders who had walked from the Great Lakes country. The Etowah workers laid these pieces out on flat stones the size of a man's chest. The stones were river granite, grey and speckled, worn shiny in the middle from years of pounding. Beside each stone sat a small hide bag of polishing sand, a bundle of antler tines, and a row of hammerstones lined up by weight, smallest to largest, like the keys of some quiet instrument. The work began at dawn. A worker would heat a copper sheet in a small clay hearth, just enough to soften the metal. Then he would lay it on the granite anvil and begin to tap, tap, tap. The sound carried out over the water and across the fields, up and down the row of workshops. The same soft music played, dozens of small hammers finding their rhythm together, like rain on a tin roof, but older, slower, more patient. The copper grew thinner under those hammers. It spread out like dough under a rolling pin. A sheet that started thick as your thumb would, by sundown, be no thicker than a fingernail, wide enough to drape across a man's shoulders. The workers turned it constantly, tapping the back, tapping the front, smoothing the edges with bone tools. The metal warmed in their hands. It took on the color of fresh blood at first, then darkened to the color of an old penny pulled from a creek. Once the sheet was thin enough, the real magic began. The worker would lay it face down over a wooden form, a carved block of cedar or hickory shaped like the image he meant to bring out. Then he pressed and tapped from behind, raising the shape from inside the metal, pushing the copper up into the design. A bird's wing here, a human eye there, a circle of dots like stars around the edge. This is the craft they call repousse, and the people of Etowah did it as well as anyone who has ever lived. The workshop smelled of wood smoke and warm metal, and the sharp tang of beeswax, which they melted to fill in the back of each plate and hold the shape steady. The light inside was dim, lit by small fires and by the river glow spilling through the open doors. The workers sat on woven mats, their tools laid out around them in neat half circles. They wore plain skin aprons stained green from the copper. And here is the strange part, the part the old stories always come back to. They worked in silence, not the silence of people concentrating, something deeper. The chroniclers who heard the tales from Cherokee elders said the workshop floor was a place where no voice rose above a whisper, no songs, no jokes, no calling out from one bench to another. The only sound was the tapping of the hammers and the slow breath of the river outside. Children were not allowed past the door. Women brought food to the threshold and set it down and walked away. The priests, those silent men we keep circling back to, moved among the benches like shadows, watching, sometimes laying a hand on a worker's shoulder, sometimes lifting a finished plate and turning it slowly in the dim light. Some say the silence was a rule of the craft, a way to keep the worker's mind clear. Others say the copper itself demanded it, that the metal was a living thing, and the noise of human chatter would spoil whatever spirit they were trying to coax into the shape. Both stories survive. Nobody alive today can say which one is true, or whether the truth was something else entirely, something the silent priests carried with them when they finally walked away. Among all the things the diggers found at Etowah, one type of object stands apart from the rest. It sits in glass cases now, in museums where the lights are kept low. People walk past it and slow down without quite knowing why. The thing they are looking at is a face made of beaten copper, thin as a leaf, beautiful as a calm pond at dawn. These are the masks of hammered sun. Picture a sheet of pure copper, pounded flat with a stone hammer until it is no thicker than birch bark. Now picture a craftsman working by firelight, lifting that sheet against a wooden form. He taps it gently from behind. He turns it. He taps again, slowly A nose rises out of the metal, then cheekbones, then a curved brow. The copper bends and rises and softens under his hands until it stops being metal at all and starts being a face. The mask has lips, but lips are closed. The eyes are open, but they do not look at you. They look just past you, the way a sleeping man's eyes might if his lids slipped open in a dream. The expression on the face is calm, almost gentle, almost kind. Whoever made it knew how a human face holds peace, and they pressed that peace into the metal until it stayed there forever. The size is the first strange thing. These masks are not the size of a child's toy. They are the size of a grown man's face. You could lift one and hold it over your own and look out through the empty eyes and see the world tinted the color of old fire. The second strange thing is the surface. The copper was burnished until it shone like still water at sunset. People who have held the cleaned pieces say the metal seems to glow from inside, even now, even after 600 years in wet Georgia clay. Imagine what they looked like when they were new. Imagine one of the silent priests, turning his head in the firelight, the mask flashing red and gold across the crowd, the whole copper face seeming to breathe with the flames. The third strange thing is the workmanship. There were no rolling mills here, no drop hammers, no machines of any kind. Every sheet was made by hand, pounded out from a raw lump of native copper, dragged down from the Great Lakes 1,000 miles away. To beat a nugget into a flat sheet that wide, that thin, that even, without cracking it, takes a level of skill that modern coppersmiths still talk about with respect. One slip, one spot pounded too hard, the whole sheet splits and the work is ruined. The masks at Etowah do not have those splits. They are flawless. Nobody knows how long a single mask took to make. Some who have studied them guess weeks, some guess months. Some guess that the smiths worked in shifts, generation handing the unfinished piece to generation, the way cathedral builders in old Europe did with their stones. And then there is the question that nobody can answer at all. Who were these masks made for? They were not buried with ordinary people. They were placed in deep tombs, wrapped in woven cloth, set over the faces of the dead, like a second skin. The men beneath them wore copper plates on their chests, and pearls in their ears and beads of river shell around their necks. They were laid out facing the rising sun. Their bones say they ate better food than the rest of the city. Their teeth show no signs of hard labor. They were, in every way the earth still remembers, set apart. Some scholars say the masks were portraits, likenesses of the dead, made to carry the soul forward. Others say they were not faces of men at all. They were faces of the sun itself, pressed into copper, because copper was the closest thing on earth to captured sunlight. A few have suggested something stranger, that the masks were worn by the living priests during ceremony, and only laid over the dead at the very end. That somewhere in Etowah, on certain nights, a row of silent men stood at the top of the great mound, with the firelight burning across their copper faces, looking down at a city that believed they were no longer entirely human. We do not know which of these is true. We may never know. What we know is that the masks were made, that hands worked the metal in a city that no longer exists, that the faces came out gentle and quiet and turned towards something we cannot see. Now, not everyone who heard about Etowah believed what they were told, and honestly you can understand why. The story sounds too strange. A lost city in the Georgia woods, silent priests in copper masks, workshops humming day and night, beside a river most people had never heard of. The doubters had good reasons to push back, and their voices have been part of this mystery from the very beginning. The first wave of skeptics came in the 1800s, when serious gentlemen in serious coats began writing in serious journals. They looked at the mounds rising from the Etowah floodplain, and they said simply that no native people could have built them, not because of any deep study, because of their own beliefs about who was capable of what. So they invented a vanished race, a lost tribe, a wandering band of Welsh sailors, Phoenicians who somehow crossed the sea, anything but the obvious answer sitting right in front of them. This kind of skepticism wasn't really skepticism at all. It was a refusal to see. And when the diggers in 1883 pulled the first copper headdresses from the earth, the men who wrote about them often credited some imagined foreign hand, a Viking, an Egyptian, a traveler from somewhere across the ocean. They could not bring themselves to write the simple sentence that the people of this valley made these things with their own hands. But there was a second kind of doubter, and this one had a sharper mind. These were the careful scholars who looked at the copper plates and said, "Hold on. Maybe these objects weren't made at Etowah at all. Maybe they came from somewhere upriver, from Cahokia, far to the north on the Mississippi, from Spiro, out in what became Oklahoma, from Moundville in the Alabama hills." The styles matched, the symbols repeated across hundreds of miles, the forked design, the long-nosed god with his copper ears. These same images turned up everywhere the great mound builders had lived. So the careful scholars asked a fair question. If the same art shows up across half the continent, how do we know Etowah was a workshop and not just a customer? How do we know the priests in their hammered masks were craftsmen and not buyers? Maybe Etowah was rich, yes. Maybe Etowah was holy. But maybe the copper itself came from somewhere else, finished and ready, traded up the river roads for shell and salt and stories. It is a strong argument. The copper sheets used in the southeast came mostly from the Great Lakes, 1,000 miles north. The shells came from the Gulf, hundreds of miles south. Etowah sat in the middle, a crossroads, a place where things passed through. Trade can explain a lot of what was found in those mounds without any furnaces glowing on the riverbank at all. And yet, here is where even the doubters slow down and rub their chins, because the diggers in the workshops along the river found something hard to argue with. They found scrap. They found cut edges. They found bits of copper sheet trimmed and discarded, the leftovers of someone working the metal right there in the soft Georgia dirt. They found polishing stones with copper dust still pressed into their grooves. They found the unfinished pieces, the half-shaped plates, the masks with one eye hammered out, and the other still flat and waiting. You do not throw away those things if you are only buying finished goods. You throw them away if you are making. So the skeptics adjusted. Perhaps the raw copper came from the north, they said, but the shaping happened here. Perhaps Etowah was a finishing house, a place where rough sheets became sacred objects under the hands of people who knew the work. That theory holds together better. It honors the trade roads and the workshops both, and it still leaves room for the silent priests who guarded what they made. What no one has ever fully explained is the sheer concentration of it. The amount of copper buried in Mount C alone is staggering. More finished plates, more headdresses, more ceremonial axes than turn up at almost any other site in the southeast. Whatever Etowah was, it was not a quiet country town with a few imported trinkets. It was a center, a heavy one, a place where wealth and meaning piled up faster than the ground could hold them. The skeptics can argue about where the metal came from. They can argue about who shaped it and who simply traded for it. What they cannot argue away is the weight of what came out of those mounds. The weight of all that copper. The weight of all those silent faces sleeping in the red Georgia earth for 600 years before a shovel finally found them. In the spring of 1883, a man named John Rogan came to the banks of the Etowah River with a shovel, a notebook, and the calm certainty of someone who already knew what he would find. He worked for the Bureau of Ethnology, a young arm of the Smithsonian, and his orders were simple. Open the smaller of the 3 great mounds, record everything, take what the earth offered. Rogan was not a loud man. The few photographs we have show him with a soft beard, a stiff collar, and eyes that look slightly tired, as if he had already seen too much for one lifetime. He had dug mounds in Tennessee. He had dug mounds in North Carolina. He thought he understood what lay beneath these grassy hills. He was wrong. The mound he chose stood about 25 feet high, rounded at the top like a loaf of bread left to rise in the sun. Cedar trees grew on its slopes. The local farmers called it Mound C, the third sister, the quiet one. Rogan and his small crew of laborers began at the southern flank. They cut a long trench inward, shoveling the red Georgia clay into wooden barrows, sweat darkening the backs of their shirts in the warm April light. For 2 days they found nothing but dirt and stone. Then on the 3rd day a shovel struck something that rang back. Not the dull thud of rock, a clean, soft metal note, like a bell wrapped in cloth. Rogan knelt down. He brushed the soil away with his fingers. And there, 6 feet down inside an American hill, lay a sheet of hammered copper the size of a dinner plate. On its face was a figure in profile, a man with the beak of a falcon and the eye of a god. Wings spread from his shoulders. His hand held a severed head. The copper had gone green with age, but the lines were as crisp as the day they were struck. Rogan wrote in his notebook that evening, by the light of an oil lamp, in a hand that barely shook. He described the plate. He described its weight. He described the way the figure seemed to be dancing, or flying, or both at once. He did not speculate. He did not embellish. He simply wrote down what he saw. The next morning, they found another, and another. By the end of the week, the crew had pulled from that single mound a treasure that made grown men stop and stare. Copper plates stacked like dinnerware, engraved shell cups from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles south. Axes of polished greenstone, their handles long rotted away. Marble figures of a seated man and a kneeling woman, their faces calm as sleeping children. Pearls by the thousand, drilled and strung and laid across the chests of the dead, and the dead themselves. Tall men, broad in the shoulder, laid out in cedar-lined chambers with their finery around them. Some wore copper headdresses shaped like antlers. Some wore masks of beaten copper across their faces, the eye holes empty and patient. Rogan's letters back to Washington grew shorter as the dig went on. Not because he had less to say, because he had more than words could carry. He wrote to his superior, Cyrus Thomas, that the site was unlike anything in his experience. He wrote that the workmanship of the copper rivaled anything coming out of Europe in the same period. He wrote that whoever had been buried in this mound had been treated as something more than human. When he came home to Washington that summer, the artifacts came with him in wooden crates packed with straw. The newspapers caught wind of the find. Reporters asked Rogan what he thought it all meant. He answered them plainly. He said the people who built Etowah were a great civilization. He said they made these things with their own hands, in their own country, with skill that matched any nation on earth. He said the idea that the mounds were built by some lost white race, or by Vikings, or by wandering Israelites, was nonsense. That stance cost him friends. In 1883, the popular taste was for romance. People wanted lost tribes and sunken kingdoms. Rogan offered something quieter and harder to swallow. He offered the truth that the builders of these wonders were the ancestors of the very people America had spent a century pushing west. He never softened that position. He died in 1888, only 46 years old, his notebook still neat, his certainty still cold and clean as river water. The crates he packed sit in the Smithsonian still. Walk the Etowah Valley today, and the land feels heavier than it should. The grass grows thick and slow in certain spots. The trees lean in patterns that don't match the wind. Old farmers around Cartersville used to say the ground here remembers more than it lets on. There is a meadow at the foot of the great mound where nothing tall ever takes root. Pines try, sweet gums try. They come up in spring and grow waist-high by summer, then quietly give up. The soil holds them like loose teeth. Pull one out and the roots come away clean, shallow, almost frightened of the deeper earth below. Locals have a name for it. They call it the smelting floor, though no one alive ever saw a furnace burn there. The name passed from grandfather to grandson, the way good stories do, worn smooth by 100 tellings. The story says that under that flat patch of grass lies a layer of fired clay, baked hard as brick, and beneath that lies something else. In the 1950s, a man tried to build a small tool shed at the edge of this meadow. He dug his footings 3 feet down and hit a crust he could not break with a shovel. He brought a pickaxe. The pickaxe rang off the surface like a bell. When he finally chipped through, the air that rose out of the hole smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had touched that ground in 600 years. He filled the hole back in and built his shed somewhere else. The river itself acts strange along this stretch. The Etowah curves wide and slow as it passes the old city, almost as if it is giving the place room to breathe. Older maps show the channel running closer to the mounds. Surveyors in the 1820s sketched it tight against the bluff. By 1880, the water had pulled itself back, leaving a soft crescent of silt where the workshops once stood. Geologists shrug and say rivers wander. The old families nod and say the water moved because it was asked to. In the cool months, a low fog gathers in the meadow before it gathers anywhere else. It hangs about knee-high and stays there past sunrise, long after the rest of the valley has cleared. Photographers who come to the park at dawn always notice it. They frame their shots around it. Some of them, looking later at their pictures, find soft shapes in the mist they don't remember seeing through the lens. Most people call it a trick of the eye. The land just smiles and keeps its counsel. Deer come down the slope to drink at the river, but they cross the smelting floor in a hurry. You can watch them from the parking area in the early evening. They pick their way carefully through the brush, ears swiveling, and the moment their hooves touch that flat ground, they break into a quick trot. They do not stop to graze. They do not lower their heads. They pass through like guests in a stranger's house, polite and brief. Dogs feel it too. Park rangers tell of leashed dogs that walk happily along the mound trails until they reach a certain bend. There the animal will sit down and refuse to go further. No growling, no whining, just a quiet refusal, like a child going limp in a doorway. Walk the dog around the lawn way, and it is cheerful again. Foresters who study the trees around the site have noticed something stranger still. The oaks that ring the central plaza grow in a near-perfect circle, and the rings inside their trunks are tighter on the side facing the mound. Trees grow toward the light. These trees seem to grow away from something. No one has a clean answer for it. A folklore collector named Ruth Bender wrote in 1937 that the older black families in Bartow County would not let their children play on the mound after dusk. She asked why and got the same answer from 3 different grandmothers. They said the ground was still warm down deep. They said if you laid your ear against the side of the platform mound on a quiet night, you could hear a steady tapping, like a small hammer on soft metal far below. She tried it herself. She wrote that she heard only her own pulse, but she also wrote that she did not try a second time. The land does not speak in words. It speaks in fog and root and the path a deer chooses. It remembers fires that went out before the Spanish came, and hands that worked copper by torchlight, and feet that walked away one morning and never walked back. The valley keeps that memory the way a stone keeps heat after the sun is gone. What happened at Etowah did not happen only at Etowah. That is the strange thing about this story, and the reason it pulls at the sleeve of anyone who studies it long enough. The same shape of mystery shows up in other places, under other names, in other centuries. You can lay them side by side like cards on a table, and the patterns line up in ways that feel too tidy to be chance. Take the twin brothers of Spiro, Oklahoma, a place that sat 700 miles west of the Georgia hills. Spiro had its own great mound, its own copper, its own silent men in feathered cloaks. The diggers who tore into Spiro in the 1930s pulled out the same kinds of shell cups, the same hammered birds, the same strange faces with weeping eyes. Two great cities, separated by rivers and forests and weeks of hard travel, had been making the same art, telling the same stories, burying the same gods. And both had been abandoned, swept clean, left to the grass and the deer. The old stories told by people in eastern Oklahoma speak of brothers, two leaders who came from somewhere far away, who knew the shape of the sun and the secret names of the copper. One brother went west and built a city by the Arkansas River. The other brother went east and built a city by the Etowah. They never spoke after they parted, but they sent gifts back and forth across the long trails. A shell from the Gulf, a pearl from a deep river, a plate of beaten copper showing a falcon with a forked eye. The story is folklore, and nobody can prove it, but the artifacts agree with the folklore in a way that makes scholars rub their foreheads. The same forked eye appears on copper from both cities. The same dancing figures, with the same beaded knees and the same long ear spools, the same posture of the arms. If two artists living 1,000 miles apart had drawn these things by accident, it would be the strangest accident in the history of American art. You see this echo elsewhere too. Up in southern Illinois, the great city of Cahokia rose on the Mississippi floodplain and grew larger than London at the same time. Cahokia had platform mounds taller than anything at Etowah. Cahokia had its own quiet priests, its own copper workshops, its own marble figures sitting cross-legged with hands on knees. Cahokia, too, emptied out. The fires went cold, the plazas filled with weeds. By the time French traders paddled past in the 1600s, the local people could only point at the green hills and say, "We don't know who built them." 3 cities, 3 collapses, 3 silences, and in each silence, the same kinds of things left behind in the dirt, like signatures of one long vanished hand. Some folklorists call this whole web of stories the Mississippian world, though that name is just a placeholder for a thing nobody fully understands. The old people of the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Caddo, all kept fragments. A song here, a name there, a warning passed from grandmother to grandchild about a city of priests who knew too much and lost the right to know it. The fragments do not stitch into one quilt, but they do not contradict each other either. They feel like pieces of a window that broke a long time ago. There is a tale in northern Georgia about a hunter who fell asleep on a ridge above the Etowah and dreamed of a man in a copper mask. The man in the mask told him, "We did not leave. We only walked sideways out of the world." When the hunter woke, he found a single shell bead in his palm, white as a tooth, smooth as river ice. He carried it for the rest of his life and would not say where it was. Stories like that exist for Spiro too, and for Cahokia, and for Moundville down in Alabama, where the priests carved hands with eyes in the palms, and then, one quiet century, simply stopped. The hand with the eye stares out of museum cases now, behind humming glass, and the eye does not blink. What ties these cities together is not just art or trade, it is the way they ended, not in fire, not in slaughter, not in plague that left bones piled in doorways. They ended in silence. The people walked out. The fires went cold. The copper sheets went into the ground with the dead, and the living took their songs and went somewhere else. Etowah is the eastern brother of that long story, and the brother kept his secrets just as well as the others. Picture a wooden crate in the back room of a small museum. In North Georgia, the crate is old, the wood is dry and pale. The nails rusted to a soft orange. Inside, wrapped in cotton and yellowed paper, sits a copper plate the size of a dinner platter. The metal is dark green in some places, and bright like a new penny in others. You can hold it in your hands and feel the weight of 1,000 years. That plate did not start its life at Etowah. The copper inside it came from the shores of Lake Superior, nearly 1,000 miles to the north. Geologists have traced the chemical fingerprint, and the match is clean. Someone carried that raw copper south, across rivers, through forests, over ridges, until it reached the workshops along the muddy banks of the Etowah River. Then, a quiet craftsman with a stone hammer beat it into the shape of a dancing man with the wings of a falcon. The plate is only one piece. The shelves of certain museums hold dozens more. There are conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, deep and pink-throated, carved into round pendants called gorgets. There are shark's teeth from saltwater coasts hundreds of miles away. There is mica from the high blue mountains of North Carolina, sliced into thin shimmering sheets that catch the light like frozen water. There is galena, a heavy silver-gray stone from the lead country of Missouri, ground down into a fine powder the priests once used to paint their faces. None of these things grew in Georgia. None of them came up out of the red clay around Cartersville. They walked here on someone's shoulders. That is the puzzle the artifacts press into your palm. A trade road, or a web of trade roads, stretched across half a continent before any European boot touched the soil, and Etowah sat near the center of it, like a fat spider on a wide silk web. The strangest pieces of all came from a place called Cahokia. Cahokia stood far to the northwest, near where the Missouri River pours into the Mississippi, just across from what is now St. Louis. In its day, it was the largest city north of Mexico. Tens of thousands of people lived there. Its great central mound rose taller than any earthwork in the south. When diggers opened the burial mound at Etowah in the late 1800s, they found objects that looked exactly like objects coming out of the ground at Cahokia. The same forked eye, the same long stone maces, polished smooth, far too thin to fight with. The same hooded human heads, carved out of clay and shell. Either the people of Cahokia came down the river to trade with the priests at Etowah, or the priests at Etowah copied the patterns from drawings sent south, or some third thing happened that nobody alive can explain. Some scholars believe entire families left Cahokia when it began to empty out, and walked south carrying their old gods with them. Others believe the gods traveled in the other direction. Born here in the Red Hills and exported north along the rivers. The artifacts will not say. They only sit in their drawers, identical, separated by 1,000 miles of forest. There is a single shell cup in a Washington collection that shows the matter plainly. The cup is a conch, hollowed and polished, with figures cut into its smooth outer wall. A man kneels in profile. He wears a long cloak, a beaded belt, and a beak strapped over his nose like a mask. In one hand he holds a severed human head, in the other a stone mace. That exact figure appears on plates and gorgets from Oklahoma to Tennessee to Georgia. The same mask, the same posture, the same beaded belt. He is recognized everywhere across the southeast and the lower Mississippi, like a saint with a face the whole region knew by heart. And nobody now living remembers his name. A traveler walking into Etowah 1,000 years ago would have seen these visitors arriving in long dugout canoes pulled up onto the bank. They would have carried bundles wrapped in soft deerskin. The silent priests would have come down from the high mound to meet them in their white cloaks, their copper headdresses catching the light. Their hands open in greeting. Words may not have passed at all. The object spoke for them, hand to hand, river to river, hill to hill. What you can hold in your palm proves that something larger than Etowah once existed. A network, a shared language of signs and shapes. A faith with many houses, scattered across a continent, with the city by the river as one of its brightest lamps. Long after the last fires went cold at the city by the Etowah, the stories did not die. They moved into kitchens, they moved into front porches and parlors, and the soft hours after Sunday dinner. Families in the Red Hills of North Georgia kept passing them down, one grandmother to one grandchild, the way you pass down a recipe or a quilt. 3 pictures kept coming up: the falcon, the eye, the hand. The falcon was the easiest to picture. Old folks said their great-grandfathers had seen the copper plates in person, back when the diggers came through. The bird on those plates had a hooked beak and a fierce stare, and a mark across its eye like a streak of black paint. Children who heard the story would dream of it. They would picture a hawk made of beaten sunlight hanging in the air above the river, watching everything below with a patience that felt older than the trees. The eye came up almost as often. Some families called it the open eye. Others called it the eye in the hand. They spoke of a copper symbol carved or hammered into a flat sheet, an eye floating inside the palm of a human hand. Nobody could agree on what it meant. One grandfather, a tobacco farmer near Cartersville, told his grandchildren the eye was how the silent priests saw across long distances. Another, a railroad worker over in Rome, said the eye was a window the dead looked back through to check on the living. The hand by itself had its own life in the stories. Sometimes it was a left hand, sometimes a right. It came up in tales told late, when the coffee had gone cold and the lamps burned low. Aunts would say their mothers had seen a hand pressed into copper, fingers spread wide, the lines of the palm clear as a road map. They said it was the hand of a chief. They said it was the hand of a god. They said it was the hand of a priest who had touched something nobody else was allowed to touch. Over the years, the stories softened the way river stones soften. Sharp edges wore down. Names got swapped. The priests, who had once been described as terrifying figures in feathered cloaks, became gentle keepers in the retellings. They walked through the cornfields. They blessed the babies. They knew the songs that made the rain come. Some details quietly dropped away. The blood that older accounts spoke of, the offerings on the smelting floor, the long lines of mourners climbing the great mound. Grandparents who told the story to small children, left those parts out. The story got cleaner, kinder, easier to fall asleep to, but the falcon, the eye, and the hand stayed. Those 3 pictures held on like burrs in wool. A woman named Lula, born in 1902 in a farmhouse near the Etowah, told her grandchildren in the 1970s that she had seen the falcon plate herself when she was a girl. A traveling man had brought a photograph of it through the county and showed it at the schoolhouse. She said the bird looked alive. She said its eye followed her around the room. Her grandchildren laughed politely and put it down to an old woman's memory. Then, one of them grew up, went to a museum in Atlanta, and saw the plate behind glass. She wrote her grandmother a letter that same night. The bird, she said, did follow you around the room. Other families told versions where the 3 symbols belonged together. The falcon was the sky, the hand was the earth, the eye was the thing that watched both and kept them in balance. When the eye closed, they said, the city fell. When the hand stopped working the copper, the priests went silent. When the falcon flew away, the smoke stopped rising over the Etowah forever. Folklorists who came through in the 1930s wrote some of these stories down. They noted how often the 3 pictures appeared. They noted how families who had never met one another, scattered across 3 counties, told the same shapes in slightly different words. None of those folklorists could say where the stories came from. Some thought the families had picked up the images from newspaper drawings of museum pieces. Others thought the stories went back further than any newspaper, carried down through farm hands and neighbors who had known the descendants of the people who built the place. Either way, the 3 pictures kept their grip: the falcon, the eye, the hand, a bird, a watcher, a maker. 3 pieces of something larger that nobody alive could put back together. Step back from the bones in the floor and the masks of hammered sun. Step back from the headdresses pulled from the dark Georgia clay. There is a simpler thing underneath all of it, a thing the arguments tend to bury. Something happened in this valley that mattered to the people who lived here, whether it happened exactly the way the old stories say, or some other way nobody wrote down. It shaped them. It shaped the hills. It shapes us still, in the way we lean forward when we hear about it. The story the elders carried south speaks of a long drought, not a hard summer, not a thin crop year, a drought that walked across the land like a slow grey animal, and would not leave. The Etowah ran low. The stones that lay hidden under the river all winter came up into the sun. Fish gathered in the last cool pools and died there in silver heaps. The corn came up thin and yellow, no taller than a child's knee. The squash vines curled brown on the dust. The priests went up onto the mound. They wore the copper plates that caught the morning light like small still suns. They held the marble figures in their hands. The drummers drummed. The smoke rose from the furnaces along the river, thin now, because there was less wood to spare and fewer mouths to feed. The people watched from the plaza below and waited for the rain. The rain did not come. You can feel, even now, what that meant. A city built on the idea that the priests could speak to the sky. A city built on the idea that the copper sun in their hands answered the real sun overhead. A city that had eaten well and traded far and buried its great ones with shell and pearl, because someone, somewhere, was holding the world together. And then the world did not hold. The sky stayed empty and white. The wind came hot off the red hills and lifted the dust and carried it through the empty workshops. People will forgive a great many things. They will forgive a hard winter. They will forgive a lost battle. They will forgive even the death of a beloved chief, because death is a thing every grandmother knows how to fold into a story. What they will not forgive, in the end, is silence from the sky when the sky was promised to them. That is the deepest kind of betrayal, and no city has ever been built strong enough to stand on top of it. Maybe it was a drought. The tree rings in the southeast remember dry years in those centuries, long stretches when the rivers ran shallow and the soil cracked open. Maybe it was a sickness that moved through the longhouses and took the children first, the way sicknesses often do. Maybe it was a war, or a small civil quarrel that grew large because there was no longer enough corn to share. Maybe the trade roads broke somewhere far to the north, and the copper stopped coming, and the priests had nothing new to hammer into suns. Maybe all of it at once. The point underneath the theories is this: something arrived in the valley that the people there could not answer. Their tools could not fix it. Their songs could not fix it. The silent priests who had stood on that mound for generations and watched the river curl past in its slow brown loop could not fix it. And when a thing arrives that a whole way of life cannot answer, the way of life does not bend, it breaks. You can stand on the mound today in the soft late light and feel the shape of that breaking. The grass is green and ordinary. The river is full again, fat with summer rain. The pines along the ridge whisper their easy whisper. None of it remembers anything on the face of it. And yet there is a quietness to the place that does not feel like other quiet places. It feels like a held breath. It feels like a room someone walked out of in the middle of a sentence. We do not need to know exactly what the drought was, or whether it was a drought at all. We only need to know that the people who lived here believed, for a long time, that the world could be steadied by their hands. They built furnaces and workshops, and tall earthen platforms on the strength of that belief. And then, one season, 1 year, one slow turning of the seasons, the world did not steady, and the copper city, with all its strange and beautiful certainty, began the long, slow business of letting go. Stand with me now on the floodplain along the Etowah River. The year does not matter. Pick a night, somewhere near the end, when the last of the coppersmiths still slept in their cane houses, and the priests still walked the high mound at dusk. Let the centuries fall away like leaves from a tired branch. The air is cool against your skin. It smells of river mud and wood smoke, of damp grass and the faint metal tang that always hung around this place. The sky above the valley is wide and black and full of stars. So many stars. They press down like a great quilt stitched with silver pinpricks, low enough that you feel you could reach up and touch them with the tips of your fingers. The river runs slow tonight. You can hear it. A soft whisper of water sliding over smooth stones, threading between the dark shapes of willows on the far bank. Somewhere out in the cornfields, a screech owl calls once and falls silent. The frogs along the shallows sing in long, lazy waves, rising and falling like breath. The great mound rises behind you. It blots out a piece of the sky, a pyramid of packed earth, taller than 7 men standing on one another's shoulders. By day, its sides are red clay, scrubbed smooth by countless bare feet on the climbing ramps. By night, it is just a shape, a darker dark, a hill that should not be there. The temple at its summit is invisible from down here, but you know it stands up there, its thatched roof catching starlight, its painted posts watching the 4 directions. The smaller mounds crouch around it like sleeping animals. The houses of the people spread out beyond them in neat rows, their roofs low and round under the night. A few cook fires still glow orange between the lodges, small as fallen embers from the bigger blaze of stars overhead. A baby cries somewhere far off and is hushed. A dog barks once, and then the strange thing, the thing you came here to feel. The furnaces are cold. For as long as anyone living can remember, the night air along this river has carried the breath of fire. The smelting floors burned through the dark hours. Smoke threaded up from a dozen workshops, smelling of charcoal and hot stone, and the sharp green ghost of melting copper. The hammers rang. The voices of the smiths murmured under the roof beams as they tended the coals and worked the soft metal into sheets thin as a leaf. Tonight there is none of that. The workshops sit silent. The clay furnaces along the river are dark mouths in the dark. No glow, no hammer, no song. The priests who tended the sacred fires on the high mound have let them go to ash. You can smell the absence of smoke, the way you would smell the absence of bread in a kitchen at dawn. Nobody planned this night. Nobody rang a bell or made a speech. The drought has gone on for years. The corn came up small and brown. The deer moved off into other hills. One by one, the families have begun to gather their bundles and slip away down the trading paths, south toward the coast, north toward the Blue Mountains, east toward kin they have not seen in 3 generations. The silent priests still walk the mound. You can almost see them, pale shapes in long robes of woven mulberry bark, their faces hidden behind those hammered copper masks that catch what little light the stars provide. They move without speaking, as they have always moved. They climb the ramps. They circle the empty temple. They lay their hands on the cold hearth and feel the chill of it under their palms. The crickets do not care. The river does not care. The frogs sing as they sang 1,000 years before the first mound was raised, and as they will sing 1,000 years after the last beam falls. A bat flickers across the face of the moon. A fish rolls in the shallows with a small wet sound, and the rings spread out and vanish. Stand here a while. Feel how small you are. Feel the weight of all those stars above you and the soft pulse of the river below, and the great dark shape of the mound at your back. A whole city is going to sleep tonight, and many of these people will not be here when the sun comes up. They do not know yet. Not all of them, but the land knows. The night knows. The fires have gone cold, and the long quiet has begun. The fires went cold, and the people walked away, and the great city on the Etowah became something else. Not a ruin exactly, not yet. For a long time it sat there like a sleeping body, the mound still rising from the river bend, the workshops still smelling faintly of metal when the wind moved through them. The forest came back slow. Vines crept up the temple steps. Sapling oaks pushed through the floors where copper had been hammered into the shapes of birds and suns. And the people who came after carried the city with them, even when they did not speak its name. The Cherokee moved into these valleys in the years that followed. They built their own towns along the same rivers, drank from the same springs, fished the same green pools. They knew the mounds were not theirs. They knew the mounds were old. When their elders walked past the great platform, they walked softly, the way you walk past a sleeping grandfather. They did not climb it. They did not dig in it. They called it a place that belonged to people who came before, and they left it alone. That respect was its own kind of inheritance. It passed from grandparent to grandchild, like a recipe nobody wrote down. Don't disturb the old ground. Don't take stones from the mound to build a hearth. If you find a copper piece in the soil, leave it where it lies or carry it back. The reasons faded. The rules stayed. Stories grew in the spaces where the reasons used to be. Hunters spoke of seeing tall figures at dusk along the river, walking single file, their heads bent as if in prayer. The figures wore long robes. They made no sound. They moved between the trees like smoke moves between fingers, there and then gone. Old folks said these were the silent priests, still walking the paths they had walked in life, still tending to something only they could see. Children growing up in Bartow County heard these stories before they could read. They heard them from grandmothers, who heard them from their grandmothers, all the way back to a time when the mounds were already old and already quiet. The stories changed in small ways with each telling. Sometimes the priests carried torches that gave no light. Sometimes they carried small bundles wrapped in deerskin. Sometimes they sang a song so low you felt it in your chest before you heard it in your ears. When the white settlers came, they heard the stories too. Some laughed, some did not. The ones who built farms near the mounds learned to leave certain fields alone, the way the Cherokee had there. Plows would skip those acres. Their cattle would graze elsewhere. A man might not be able to tell you why, only that his father had told him, and his father before him. The town of Cartersville grew up a few miles from the old city. It became a normal Georgia town, with churches and a courthouse and a railroad running through. But there was always something different about it, a certain way of looking at the world. People in Cartersville did not roll their eyes when somebody mentioned the mounds. They nodded. They knew somebody who had found a piece of carved shell in a creek bed. They knew somebody whose grandfather had seen a tall-robed figure walking the tree line one autumn evening. Every spring, families would walk out to the site and look at the great mound rising from the meadow. They would stand at the base and tilt their heads back and try to imagine the towers that had once stood up there. The children would ask questions. The parents would answer as best they could, which was not very well, because nobody really knew. That not knowing became part of the answer. It became part of what people from this place understood about the world. The understanding went like this: the world is older than your grandfather, older than his grandfather, older than the oldest story he ever told you. Things happened here that nobody alive can explain. Cities rose, cities fell. People prayed in languages we will never hear. Smoke from green fires curled up into a sky that watched it all and said nothing. And if you stand quiet enough on the mound at dusk, with the Etowah running silver below you and the swallows cutting their wide circles overhead, you might feel a hand on the back of your neck, not cold, not warm, just present, just the soft weight of all those years, leaning gently against you, the way an old friend leans when there is nothing left to say. His name was Elias Coker, and he came to North Georgia from the Carolinas in the spring of 1847. He was 31 years old, lean as a fence rail, with hands the color of saddle leather. His wife had died in childbirth the winter before, and the baby had followed her 2 days later. So Elias sold his tobacco farm for less than it was worth, and walked west until the road ran out near the bend of the Etowah River. The land he settled on was cheap because nobody wanted it. The soil was strange there, dark in places, ashy in others, full of broken stone and odd little lumps of green metal that the locals said came up after every hard rain. The old men in town warned him. They said the ground had a memory, and the memory was not always kind. Elias only nodded. He had no use for warnings anymore. He built a small cabin under a stand of pines and put in a field of corn. The mule pulled the plow in straight, clean lines, and Elias walked behind it, watching the soil curl up like brown ribbon. On the third morning, the plow caught on something hard. He thought it was a root. He bent down and pulled away the dirt with his fingers. What he lifted out was a sheet of copper about the size of a dinner platter. It was thin, beaten flat, and bent at one corner where the iron blade had struck it. On the surface, hammered up from underneath, was the figure of a man with the wings of a hawk. The man held an eye in one hand and a long curved blade in the other. His mouth was a single straight line, sealed shut, the way the silent priests were said to keep their own mouths. Elias sat down in the dirt and looked at it for a long time. He did not know the stories yet. He only knew that the metal was warm in his hands, warmer than the morning sun could explain, and that the eye in the figure's palm seemed to look back at him. He took the plate home and laid it on the table where his wife's Bible used to sit. He cleaned it slowly with a rag and a little vinegar. The green corrosion came off in soft flakes, and underneath, the copper glowed the color of a banked fire. He could not stop touching it. Word got around. A Cherokee man named John Walkingstick came up from below the river and stood on the porch with his hat in his hand. He looked at the plate for a long time without speaking. Then he told Elias what his grandmother had told him. He spoke of the city that once stood near here, of the mounds rising green out of the cornfields, of the men in white deerskin who walked the platforms and never opened their mouths. He spoke of the copper masks and the Falcon and the long drought. When he was done, he refused the coffee Elias offered him and walked back down the road. Elias did not sell the plate. Men came from Atlanta with money, and he turned them away. A professor from the college in Athens wrote him 3 letters. Elias did not answer. He kept the copper wrapped in oilcloth in a cedar box under his bed, and he took it out only at night, by candlelight, alone. In 1856, he moved again. He went west, all the way to a little town in Missouri called Sweet Springs, and he carried the plate with him in a leather satchel that he never let out of his sight. He married a woman named Margaret there. He had 3 children. He never farmed again. He worked as a blacksmith, which suited his quiet ways, and on Sunday evenings he would sit on the porch with his oldest boy and tell him about the city by the Etowah River. He told it the way Walkingstick had told it to him, slow and careful, leaving out nothing. His son told his own children, they told theirs. The plate stayed in the cedar box, moving from house to house, state to state, traveling further from Georgia with every generation. It went to Kansas. It went to Colorado. It ended up, sometime in the 1930s, in a small farmhouse outside of Bend, Oregon, 3,000 miles from the river where Elias Coker first lifted it from the soil. The story moved with it, softer each time, simpler, but always with the same shape. A city, a priest who would not speak, a drought no prayer could break, and a thin sheet of hammered copper that still felt warm to the touch. In the summer of 1883, the wagons came down from the north. They rolled into Cartersville with their wheels caked in red Georgia clay. The men who climbed down wore dark coats and round spectacles, and they spoke in the clipped, careful voices of educated men from Washington. They carried letters from the Bureau of Ethnology. They carried shovels and brushes and small wooden crates lined with cotton wadding. They had come for the mounds, the crates filled fast, copper plates wrapped in birch bark, soft as old leather and green with the slow breath of time. Stone effigies, shell gargets carved with spiders and crosses, and circling birds, pearl beads by the thousand, marble figures, a man and a woman, sitting with their hands folded on their knees, their eyes carved open and calm. The diggers worked through the long Georgia summer, and when fall came, the crates went back north on the railroad. They went to a building on the National Mall in Washington. They went into the Smithsonian, And there, in basement rooms with iron racks and brass tags, most of what came out of Etowah went to sleep again. You can see some of it if you know where to look. A few plates hang behind glass. The marble figures sit in a quiet gallery, lit from above, but the bulk of what those wagons carried away has never been displayed. It rests in drawers in climate-controlled rooms, catalogued in ledgers, studied now and then by a scholar who signs in at the front desk and signs out again at dusk. This is the strange shape of the question we are left with. The objects exist. You can hold the records in your hand. The copper is real. The shell is real. The faces carved into the marble are real, with their small mouths and their long ears and their look of patient waiting. But the meaning behind them stayed in Georgia. The meaning sank into the red clay when the fires went cold. Scholars have spent 140 years trying to read what those objects say. Some see a sun god. Some see a chief who claimed descent from a hawk. Some see a priesthood that traveled between cities along the southern rivers, carrying a single faith across 1,000 miles. Some say the falcon-eyed figure on the plates is a warrior. Others say he is a dancer. Still others say he is death himself, calm and feathered, walking on quiet feet. Every theory has a rival. Every rival has a counter. The marble man and woman might be ancestors of a royal line. They might be gods. They might be portraits of a chief and his sister, set in the burial chamber to guide him home. The serene faces give nothing away. They have held their secret for 600 years, and they will hold it 600 more. And here is the part that lingers. The diggers in 1883 did not empty Etowah. They opened one mound. They sank trenches into another. They lifted what they could carry, and they went home. The largest mound, the great platform that rises 63 feet above the river plain, was never opened. It has never been opened. Inside, that hill of packed earth, sealed by centuries of grass and rain, the heart of the city still waits. Modern archaeologists have made a quiet promise to leave it alone. The tools they have now, ground-penetrating radar and careful soil cores, can map shapes without breaking the seal. They have found rooms in there. They have found floors. They have found the long lines of timber that once held up a temple at the summit. But the chambers themselves remain shut. The priests, if priests were ever buried there, sleep on somewhere under that grass-covered slope. The answer to who they were may be lying in a cedar coffin with a copper mask laid over its face. Or it may not. The mound may hold nothing but earth and the bones of long-eaten meals nobody knows. That is the true shape of this mystery. Not a missing piece, but a sealed door and a quiet agreement among living people not to force it open. The crates in Washington hold half the riddle. The mound on the Etowah holds the other half. Between them runs a long silence, and in that silence, the silent priests still keep their counsel. They told no one their names. They told no one their gods. They built a city of copper and shell and marble, and they vanished into the hills with whatever they knew. And the door they walked through closed softly behind them. It has never quite opened again. So now you know the story, or at least as much of it as anyone can tell. The river still runs. The mounds still rise from the red Georgia clay, like the shoulders of sleeping giants. And somewhere, under the soft grass and the old pecan trees, the copper still sleeps in its quiet beds. If you went there tonight, you would find a small park, a wooden walkway, a few signs that explain what they can. You would see the great platform mound, 63 feet of packed earth, holding up nothing now but a soft crown of grass. You would see the smaller mounds beside it, like children gathered around a parent. You would see the ditch the people dug still curving through the trees, still holding rainwater after a storm. The cornfields are gone, the thatched roofs are gone. The smoke that once hung green over the valley has long since drifted away. The hammers are silent, the furnaces are cold. The priests, whoever they were, have walked off into the place where forgotten people go. But the hills remember. That is what the folks who live nearby will tell you, if you ask them gently and you wait for the answer. The hills around the Etowah remember. At dusk, when the sun slips behind the ridges and the river turns the color of beaten copper, there is a sound you can almost hear, not quite a hum, not quite a song, something older than both.